a couple of little words, at the beginning, three. The first one is we've got an important card in the back, and that is to Ron and Carolyn Harris, on the death of their son, Charlie. That service will be Saturday morning. There'll be a visitation Friday night, at Marshall Donnelly Funeral Home, and from 4 to 7, and then there's also visitation here Saturday morning for about an hour and a half before the service. I know most of you probably already know that, and some of you are very close to the family anyway. I'll be meeting with them at 1:30 today to plan the service, so that's going on. And frankly, that has taken a fair bit of my time this week, and I had originally mentioned to Will that it wasn't my plan, as has been in past years when we've done books, to hand out papers about the chapters and all, but I'm feeling somewhat pressured by my co-teacher to step up my game, and I had planned to do that, but you know, the plans off go with glee, and you don't have anything before you this morning, so there is that part. If you've not had a chance to sign it, if you would on the way out, that would be a wonderful thing. That was the first thing. I think the second thing was you're not gonna get a handout. I don't wanna hear any complaining about it.
In our evaluation.
So I realized that was, you know.
Will there be a makeup handout?
There may be a makeup handout. That's a good question. And I think that this is a strategy for you all to like my co-teacher more than me. So we'll continue to look to him for guidance as we do this baton handoff in the coming months. And there was a third thing I was gonna say, and it is, my train of thought got derailed.
What about Wednesday night?
Thank you. That wasn't what I was gonna talk about, but that's a great, we're gonna go ahead and do Faith and Film Series again this summer. It's gonna be an abbreviated one. I think there's only gonna be 5. The first 2 Wednesday nights of July, the last 2 Wednesday nights of July, and the first of August. I think I may have mentioned to you, or at least to some of you, Donovan mentioned the book Frankenstein in a sermon a number of months ago. I've not visited that book since I was a high schooler, and I was probably too young to really appreciate all that was happening in the book. And I've asked Sue Tully Trout to come in for the last 2 Sundays of July, the first 2 of August, and teach that to us. She's not able to do Wednesday nights in the fall, so I wanted to get her in front of us. So if you've not had a chance to read it, and you know, it's amazing to me that it comes from the early 1800s. I think it's 1810 or 1815. You know, 1815, what important date in Europe happened in 1815, little battle at Waterloo. You know, and you start to think about how crazy things were at that time in the world. It's a little distant from us, but Donovan mentioned that he thought it was an interesting parallel, and so I thought, well, it might be interesting to revisit that. I am going to show on the first Wednesday night the 1931 classic Frankenstein, which is a movie that I think most of you have not ever seen. You're probably more familiar with one about Frankenstein that came out in the early 1970s, done by Mel Brooks. And if you hang in through all of it, that's the last one I'm going to show on the 6th of August, and hopefully the personnel committee won't dock me for showing such inappropriate films in church.
So the first one, Boris Karloff?
It is, yeah.
That's a real Frankenstein.
That's a real Frankenstein, yeah. So, and I've seen it, but I've not seen it in, I don't know how long. A funny story about the last time I showed that in church was my first year as a seminarian. I was working at this church in Chatham, New Jersey, Ogden Memorial Presbyterian Church, that had this basement that was eerie. And I decided for fun, on Halloween weekend, I would go up on a Saturday and do kind of a coffee house in the church and then be there Sunday morning. And I decided I would go ahead and do that. And it wasn't Frankenstein. It was the neck biter, Dracula. It was an old Dracula film. And I start showing that, and a bat starts flying around the basement of this church. And Amy is absolutely terrified of snakes. Leah will call me anytime there's a spider anywhere in the house. But bats for me are the bridge across which I will not travel. I was, how do I keep these kids calm while I'm fearful myself? Anyway, so that's right. It wasn't Young Frankenstein or Frankenstein. It was Dracula I showed. Anyway.
When does it start, Don? The
It's
movies?
so the movies will start the first Wednesday of July, which is next week, the second, I think. And what we do is we invite folks come and bring a brown bag dinner at 6:30 for some visitation and fellowship, and then we'll start the movie at 7. And generally, we're done by about 9. Folks will ask me, are there theological themes or things like that? I don't think they're necessarily, well, I'm not sure. I'm sure there are, but I don't know them yet. So I need to, some of the other movies that we'll show are more intentionally sort of theologian as filmmaker, but that's the one I still, Will was away doing important stuff this week on Tuesday, so he was not here to help me figure out the last of the movies, but I've got it narrowed down to 3, so you and I can figure that out today. Tell these good people what you were doing on Tuesday.
I was up on Capitol Hill advocating for a rare kidney disease bill. Well, it's actually just for all kidney diseases. It's threefold. It'll have a Center for Excellence at the NIH. It'll have preventative measures for med students and primary care doctors to keep patients from going into basically from going into renal failure. So helping them diagnose and kind of prevent that. And then the third part is research for rare kidney diseases. And so it's a bill I've been working on for, it's in its 3rd iteration, and I was a part of getting it's a bipartisan bill, and the Republican sponsor is from the county north of where I live in Tampa, and I got him to be the co-sponsor. And this is a really long process because these standalone bills are really hard to get pushed through. So anyhow, we're in our 3rd iteration of trying to get it passed, and we've got a pretty decent, we've got 20 sponsors right now, about evenly split between Republican and Democrat. And so I was up there shaking hands and telling stories, and then we had a reception on Capitol Hill that I spoke at as a patient. Yeah.
Mr. Wilbon goes to Washington.
That's right.
That's another.
Mr. Wellman is glad he left too.
Yeah, that's another movie we ought to show. I haven't seen that one in a long time. Mr. Smith goes to Washington, remember that? Good stuff. Well, I think what I'd like to do to begin, to get you talking in your groups a little bit, is talk amongst yourselves about any question that this chapter raised for you. You do that, just take a minute or two and talk about what question, or question. I sort of thought it was pretty straightforward, but
I know. I just know them all ways, and that's like this is. Yes, it's not a really sad. I mean, I didn't know they were there with.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was.
New Testament.
Settle what was going in. Right, I mean,
Yes, oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's just something right. It was basically.
But on Christian Testament. The separation of Jews and Christians.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I agree very good on. Yeah.
Now that I've read it, that's what
Oh, I mean, I've got lots of thoughts. Yeah. I mean, I think it's, if we think about this as an incredible, just how quickly it's an estimate comes together.
Yeah.
It's like a blink of the eye.
And I'm like, I yeah, because you think about how much information is in the Old Testament, how many years, history, and the New Testament's not stored, you know, that's not.
No, I mean, like Constantine pushing out, but it's so he's kind of like influential, but he normalized a lot of stuff because they were able to do stuff more on they were like studying beforehand, it was part of those collections. The guy who played a part in that way. And also, a lot of the academic, not all of them, but a bunch of them.
How consistent.
Attributed.
Yeah.
Oh, does that mean it was? Yeah, like watch that show. We watch. So, you know, they're not, but on and I think they're. I know. Okay. I'm pretty sure that's.
But it's.
It was so weird.
It does look pretty.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So much for your life.
All right, let's come on back together.
This happened at this time, this is, you know, it's the big time at this.
What are some of the wonderings that, that bubbled up out of the conversation?
We liked reading this chapter.
Yeah,
We understood it.
I do remember what the third thing I was gonna mention, which is why do we have such a kind of a light chapter this week?
Yeah.
Right? When we were talking, we thought, well, if we did 2 chapters a week, it was gonna be like 6 weeks instead of 8 weeks to do this book. And that we thought there might need to be a pause point halfway through in case anyone needed to catch up. So that was kind of the strategy behind it. But I found myself, and it may be that Will and I spent a lot of time walking around in this subject, there weren't as many surprises to me in this. This seemed fairly straightforward. But I did wonder, before we begin reading the text of it, if there were questions that came up. So thanks, Kelly, mentioning that this was a little more straightforward. How about others? Say good. Joe?
It's, kind of amazing to me. I don't think it's something I wondered about, but, you know, there's a general perception of the Bible as being like Moses brought the laws down from the top of the mountains.
Right.
Given to us. But that really the Bible came through human.
Right.
Experience with getting together and determining, okay, this is the canon, these 2 or 3 are not.
Yeah.
Kind of reiterated that.
Thank you. I think that's a really helpful thing. You know, the tradition holds from God's mouth to Moses' pen, kind of thing. And of course, I don't think we talked about it, but when you posit that Moses wrote the Torah, then how do you deal with the end of Deuteronomy that has his own death recounted in it? You know, that seems to be a little bit of a challenge in the midst of all of that. But I think it does push, as he wants us to talk about, how is the Bible authoritative? How do we have a sense of it having authority? And again, we talked in the very first chapter about the strange new world of the Bible, which is also Karl Barth's fabulous essay about Bible and biblical authority. And I think he's gonna get where Park got at the end of how that works for us. So keep, today is not time for the rest of the story. We'll get to the rest of the story. But I think the kind of ponderings that your comment raises, Joe, is very important for us to think about how this is simultaneously very much a divine, but also a human document. And do we have confidence and trust, especially as we move into the New Testament, that the new church, the witness to Jesus and God's faithfulness through Jesus, has veracity in part because of the witness of that early church. And frankly, does God continue to speak to us a living word through these pages of the New Testament? Thanks, that's good insight. Others? Yeah, Kelly?
When did, I heard the phrase Second Testament.
Right,
When was it determined it was gonna be called New Testament?
pretty early on.
Okay.
So, we've talked, I think, just a little bit about it in my own time of being a pastor, that is to say, the last 40 years, it became popular in academic circles and then also to the church to call it the Hebrew Bible as the First Testament, as the Old Testament. And I really reject that because I think it distances for Christian its sense of God's word to us, right? And so the first chapter, or the first paragraph in here, I think gets to that in a really kind of good way, that it's an amazing thing that the early church said, no, you know, these two are our scriptures. And of course, there are some Christian denominations, and there have been folks deemed heretics in the church who wanted to say, you know, we don't need that, we only need the new church, that, you know, the Bible or the church was born at Pentecost, so anything that came before that isn't necessary. And the Scots Confession, I think it is, talks about the church, and it doesn't say the church starts at Pentecost, but the church begins in the garden, because that's where God's people begin a formation. And I've always been really not only struck by that and informed by that, but really formed by that understanding that we in the New Testament are engrafted into the people of Israel. And therefore we have some special responsibility to them in this co-testaments. I was talking to a friend yesterday, a young man of the congregation who's just come back from graduate school and is doing a 2-year Teach for America, and his placement is at Antioch Middle School. And talking about how many Spanish speakers, but how many Arabic speakers as first language he has in his class. And that one of the things he's gonna have to teach next year is religions of the world, as sort of, you know, Ur of Chaldees and the Fertile Crescent and that kind of stuff. And I suggested that he might want to read Paul Filer's book, Abraham, that a number of us read a number of summers ago, that looks at Abraham, father, through the lens of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. That, you know, the three monotheistic religions all trace back to that common ancestor. And can we find some places where we have bridge and overlap and continuity out of that? Pray for our young adults who are going into that kind of special work.
Is he teaching in a public school?
Yeah,
And then what do you do?
well, I mean, it's sort of religions of the world kind of a thing.
Still,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, that's one of the chapters in the book.
Is Houston Smith still read?
Pardon me?
Houston Smith?
I don't know if he is.
Man.
I don't know. I don't know that
In his
text.
50s?
Yeah, I don't know. Carol Busey should be here. She is more familiar with what they're teaching in schools than am I. Yeah.
His world religion text is still in use. It's been updated a bunch.
Yeah. All right, so we'll get into this. I'm starting at the first page. And one of the things I was thinking of printing for you was a picture of the Codex Sinaiticus. One of the great Bibles. Have any of you ever seen one? The British Library has one. Number of places have them that are really very significant as we look at New Testament studies.
How sound is the couplet?
We'll get to that in a minute. Let's read it. Although the usage of various languages, both ancient and modern, fluctuates between the singular term scripture and the plural term scriptures, as we have been doing in the pages of the book, the plural predominates in the New Testament and is the more accurate designation because the book is in fact made up of many books. But the Christian Bible is unlike the Jewish Tanakh in being permanently and unavoidably plural, consisting as it does of two quite separate though interlocking testaments. The new is in the old concealed, the old is in the new revealed. As a familiar Latin couplet said, the emergence of this novel concept of the one Bible that contains two testaments has been correctly called the most momentous event in the history of early Christianity, even far more reaching in its consequences than the conversion of the Emperor Constantine. But it's an event that has also been no less momentous for the history of the Bible through the ages and for the history of the relations between Judaism and Christianity. The one Bible of the two testaments was a Greek Bible, as can be seen in some of the great manuscripts, such as Codex Sinaiticus, and eventually a Latin Bible. But the idea of a Hebrew Tanakh and a Greek New Testament standing side by side on the bookshelf, which became a commonplace after a return to the sources in the Renaissance and the Reformation, and still is in thousands of libraries, was largely unknown. Thus, it was both canonization of a second exclusively Christian testament and the adoption of a version of the First Testament in a language other than the original that added to the separation of Jews and Christians, even when they claimed to be obeying the same law and reading the same prophets and chanting the same songs and quoting all of these in different languages at, or rather against each other. I think that's a remarkable opening statement. To your point, I think the couplet has been how the Christian church has read the Bible historically. And there are some branches of Christianity, especially around preaching, that is very much attuned to this notion that you know, how do we see Jesus in every passage of the Old Testament, right? That was not how I was trained to preach. I don't think it was true for Will either, but you know, brothers and sisters in the PCA, Presbyterian Church of America, some of their key homiletics professors over the years were very much taught that method of preaching. I think that's historically that has been really very true. The new is the old is concealed, and the old and the new revealed. And I think, you know, we talked about gosh, where did we talk about it? In your Sunday school class, Sunday, wasn't it? Will, a little bit, we talked about how Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. Am I?
Yeah, the law and prophets.
And the law and the prophets, right? So, you know, I think often when studying the Gospels in particular, there's that tendency to say, well, you know, God was in a bad mood in the Old Testament and got happy in the New. And yet constantly we see Jesus being lifted up as the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. And so those are, I believe, more than just, you know, intentional, like railroad car couplings, right? I mean, I believe that the early church understood that to be the case. And perhaps Jesus himself understood that to be the case.
And it was certainly Paul's message.
Exactly. Well, we'll get to Paul in a minute, but because I do think it's very interesting that in Paul, we, like Mark's gospel, right? We don't get a whole lot of the story of Jesus as a little boy. For Paul, what is so important is a cross resurrection event. I mean, that's it. So we don't hear in Paul about Jesus's good deeds, you know, it's really the cross and the resurrection. And it's going to be, I would argue, very important to understand that, because Paul's letters are the earliest written form of the Christian teaching that we have. They are around, you know, 20 to 25 to 30 or longer years before the Gospels are actually written. Right? We tend to think, so the Gospels are first because they come at the beginning part of the New Testament. And the one criticism I have of this chapter, and he may, deal with it at other places, is, you have been in my classes, what's the oldest book in the New Testament?
Galatians,
No, close though, First Thessalonians. We think it's 50, 51, 52. And it's answering the question, Paul, you said Jesus was gonna come back. And now we've got friends in the congregation who died. What about them? So these, I was gonna talk about this a little later in the chapter, but I'll just jump on board now. When it comes to the Pauline corpus, there are two phrases that you need to know. Coherence and context. Coherence and context. Paul is a missional, is a practical theologian in a missional context. What does that mean? Let me unpack that a little bit. He is practical theologian. He's not a doctrinal theologian. He wants what you believe to matter in how you live. So if he were teaching, he would probably not be in the systematics department of theology, he'd be in the practical side. What does this mean? And the structure of his letters, the first half deals with doctrine, and then the second half deals with how do you live this out? Right. Very interesting. Now, in Romans, that's a lot longer, right? It's like the first 12 chapters, and then the last part of it deals with the living out. But usually in the letters, they're almost 50-50. And so it's a coherent message. Coherence. Jesus came, he died on the cross, he was risen. And you should live out your life. Now, his understanding of what does it mean to live out faithfully is so rooted and grounded in the Old Testament, right? He wants you basically to be a good practicing Jew. So the coherent message is, for freedom Christ has set you free. Don't fall back. You don't need to do the law the same way, but the righteousness of what does it mean to be a faithful Jew, that's the kind of life he wants you to live. And because of the cross resurrection, Christ has freed us from the burden of the law. But then the context is each of these congregations are wrestling with something a little bit different. I mean, he loves the Philippians. I've had some congregations like that where it's been wonderful. We're in this together. I've also had congregations that were a whole lot more like First Corinthians, where, every year there's some sex scandal with an elder, right? I was at Dalton for 4 years, and every year I had some elder,
Randy Owens.
doing something stupid. It was crazy. It was, I'm like, God, really? Well, we just have to go back to the Bible. Yes, you do. I mean, it's unreal. And, I've been grateful that I've not had a congregation like Galatians, where, the doctrine, these two factions are going each other, and you got to use that bad language on them. I wish you mutilate yourself. It's I mean, but the longer I'm a pastor, the more empathetic I am to Paul, because my lived experience of local church life. And so part of the message here is, because of Paul, some of this stuff got around a lot, and we're not going to get into it today about the whether or not all of the things that the Bible said were written by Paul were actually written by Paul, but they got in part because they had Paul's name attached to them, and some of them are particular letters to local congregations. Others, like Colossians, probably were supposed to be read to a number of churches that were in a region. Right now in modern scholarship, Ephesians and Colossians are questionable whether or not they were actually written by Paul. But I won't get into those kind of arguments today. Anyway, let's go ahead and move on. New Testament is by far the shorter portion of the Christian Bible, occupying less of the space than the Psalms plus the major prophets. I hadn't really thought about that, but that was a helpful way to think about size, right? New Testament is not a book, but an entire library that includes a variety of early Christian literature. Gospels, the history of the book of Acts, the epistles, and then that crazy book of Revelation. He didn't deal with this as much as I thought he would. I think he mentioned only in passing that one of the reasons that the early church argued for the inclusion of Revelation was the thought that it was maybe written by John, who wrote the gospel when he was an old man. Many modern scholars say, you know, there's no way he's living to 110 years old or however old they think of it. But some of the early church fathers we know lived to their 90s or 100. And I'm not talking about Old Testament Methuselah years. One of the ways that they also determined what were early Christian scriptures before we actually had the canon pulled together is looking at sermons that some of these popular early church fathers were preaching that are still extant in the 1st and 2nd centuries that are using as their scriptures for the morning lesson texts, right? So Hebrews, right? We have no clue who wrote Hebrews. I personally think it's one of the best and most overlooked books in the New Testament. Love Hebrews. And Tom Long says Hebrews, you know, in some way, it's, what does he say? It's Christian in context, rabbinical in structure, and heroic in length. That it's really, he would argue, a sermon, right? That's a long sermon. I think what Pelikan talks about is it's very like rabbinical biblical argument from the Alexandrian school. What I can say is the Greek of Hebrews is of a higher quality than any other book in the New Testament. So what's really interesting is, and when you do literary analysis of a book, right? There's historical analysis, literary, you know, all of that. Folks are able to say, well, you know, that's not the same person who wrote this or wrote that, because the style of it's different. I remember, and Lim, my hunch is that you know this better than almost anybody else in the room. Writing for different audiences and what voice to use. One of my best friends in ministry, a guy named Chris Curry's father, had done a PhD in theology with one of the Torrances in Scotland, was a local church pastor and a great dad. And his son would occasionally share with me stuff his dad wrote. So what does a letter from your dad look like? What's a sermon to the congregation look like? What does an article to lay people look like? And what is something that's for an academic journal look like? And the facility Tom had between all of those just was mind blowing to me. I mean, I'm glad if I get a decent paragraph down on a paper, and it all comes out sort of the same way to everybody, right? I mean, golly, but literary analysis can tell us that these are not necessarily the same, voices. So, all right. Anything anybody want to say about these? We all know what the Gospels are, the Acts. One of the things I'd say about the Gospels that I find has been helpful for how I think about the Gospels. When I preach to you all, I take a text from Scripture and I try to make it intelligible to the life of this particular congregation. And I think the four evangelists are using the text of Jesus's life and are trying to apply that to four particular groups of people. It's become, I think, even more popular to talk about the Johannine community as being different than who Matthew is writing to or who Luke is writing to. And so how does that shape the text of Jesus' life? You know, folks will say, well, why aren't four the exact same? Well, you know, four different authors who are trying to make this life event significantly intelligible to a particular audience. And so they're working from much of the same material, although, you know, they're not exactly the same. We think that probably Luke and Matthew have Mark in front of them. But, you know, Luke, I think it is, uses, you know, if, for instance, Matthew would be talking about a $10 bill, Luke could be talking about a one, you know, that they use money differently there, you know. So just as when I preach, I have an idea of what this congregation needs to hear and what's significant, I think each of the four gospel writers was trying to make a different point. Now, running ahead of myself here, what did I want to say? I think on the top of my book, 103, it's sort of the middle of the second long paragraph under this section, the New Testament. Underneath the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse is the only canonical representative of a large genre of apocalyptic literature that appeared as Christian movement and well beyond it. Common to all these types of Christian literature is their setting within the communal life of early Christianity. Christian believers gathered together in homes. And, you know, this is one of the things that's hard for us to imagine, given our experience of worship is coming to a rather large room with a loud organ on a Sunday morning and worshiping together. For the early period, most of Christian worship happened in homes. And really, in the early churches, where these different gospel writers, or even where Paul is writing, there's a wide variety of what that looked like. I can't remember if any of you were part of a study that Lisa Staggs did a number of years ago, and she used a little book on Roman house churches. And in the dense populations of some of Rome that got burned by Nero, there'd be tons of people crowded in these small spaces. We think the letter of James was carried around and read, you know, as a whole letter to different Christian house church communities all over. So I think getting a sense of this kind of context is really important. Knowing themselves to be part of a universal tradition that extended backwards to the beginning of time and forward to the glorious second coming of Christ, they nevertheless formed particular and local communities. Here they served those in need, studied the law and the prophets together, right? Their original Bible is the Old Testament, okay? They shared the sacraments. It was here too that they squabbled, often quite fiercely, as the epistles to the Corinthians and Galatians amply document. That communal life is presupposed throughout, even in those New Testament passages that do not seem to reflect it. Its worship, its teaching, its use of the Old Testament, and its hope for the future are at work in the language and the content of all the books of the New Testament, despite the diversity among them. Very, very, very important to understand that, right? And as these groups are coming together, some of them obviously have deep roots in Judaism. Some, as Paul moves on, are folks who don't have any of that background at all. And so some of the things that we see are dealing with specific issues in a local congregation that may not be the same in another congregation. And so when we get to understanding Paul's gospel is, women being silent in the church, is that a problem in Corinth? Or is that a universal prescription for every church everywhere at all times, right? Those are, I think, some of the important things we have to think about. But this notion of these are particular communities that are coming together is really significant. The setting of the New Testament within Christian community is one factor that makes a biography of Jesus or a history of first century church so difficult or even impossible. 27 books of the New Testament were composed not in order to satisfy historical curiosity about the events they recounted, but to bear witness to a faith in the action of God that took place through those events. There's less historical information in the New Testament than in the Old, right?
Pelican said much the same thing about the Tanakh on page 31. It's not a chronicle, it's a testament of faith.
Right. Yeah, very, very important.
Makes sense to me. This is how canon came together. I think in almost anything significant, first you have a historical event, and that's what Paul's reacting to: crucifixion, resurrection, so forth. And then people want to know more. And so, and like you say, you also have people that don't know the Old Testament or don't know some of these other things. And so, but it's interesting to me, one of the first classes I helped teach here probably 40 years ago, we took that Presbyterian classic, The Mighty Acts of God. It's a whole year going through the Bible, and the Old Testament part of it held up reasonably well. Then you got to the New Testament, it was just a mishmash. I mean, they tried to make it a biography of Jesus.
Right.
And so there was no sense that there were 4 different gospels and so
Right.
forth. So kind of threw it away that's something different. But it's, but I think that's how we understand things. One of the first biographers of George Washington's Parson Weems, I think it took him to like the 9th edition to come up with a story about the cherry tree.
Yeah.
But if people go back and add details,
Uh-huh.
and just like anybody telling a story, Bob chooses to emphasize one thing, and I don't think that's all that important story, so I'll leave that out,
Right.
but find another story.
Right. Yeah, thank you. I think that's real helpful. For those who maybe didn't hear it quite as well, what he was suggesting is that what Pelican's talking about, how the text came together, makes sense in that first there's a historical event, then there's oral stories about it, people want to know more, and then the telling of it sometimes gets shaped and different people emphasize different things. Yeah.
And I think the point Bill was making, it was done more to make a theological point than it was to be historically accurate.
Right. Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. And again, we probably emphasized this when we were back at the beginning of Genesis. The first 6 chapters or first 11 chapters of Genesis isn't science, it isn't history, but it's theology. Who is God in the creation of all of this? What does God intend? So, anything else? No. Gospels. I'm over on my version 104. The Gospels also share with the Torah, about halfway down that first paragraph, the distinction of being that portion of the scriptures to which the modern historical Christian study of the Bible since the 18th century has devoted the most detailed attention. Though it seems to be and are dependent for much of the material on one another, as well as earlier traditional material, at least some of it oral, the first 3 Gospels are distinct books, each with its own purpose and structure. And the 4th Gospel, whatever its origin, is more individual than the other 3. Seen as a composite, however, these 4 portraits form the basis for the rest of the New Testament. Other parts are earlier, and some may seem to our taste more beautiful as literature or theologically more profound. But the Gospels occupy a special place in the outline of the Christian Bible as a presupposition for all subsequent history of instruction. So like the Torah serves in the Tanakh, the Gospels serve in the New Testament, obviously. One thing, just as a little side note, and I teased Donovan about this, mercilessly, but historically, within the Presbyterian tradition, there has been significant attention given to preaching the Old Testament. And perhaps the Old Testament prophets as well. And since we have moved to a lectionary, the combined lectionary, I feel the lectionary in a sense privileges the gospel text. And there is so much more preaching that is just happening on the gospel. I think, remember the old realtor trick that whenever you go to buy a house, you're always supposed to take a marble and put it in the center of the floor of a room, and if the marble rolls to a corner, the house is not quite flat. I think the marble runs to the gospel all the time, and I find in my own spirit having to try to balance that in my preaching, especially when I was head of staff at a church and was the primary preaching professor. And yet it is the central part of the New Testament, right? That is the central story. So we need to know that story, and we need to know it in all of its different variations. Some of you just did a rather lengthy study on Jesus in the Gospels, which is a disciple second stage study that looks at the distinctive aspects of each of the four Gospels in excruciating detail. I'm not going to, you may, from my description, realize why I've only taught that curriculum once. Long time. Yeah, God bless you. So this,
Yeah.
yes,
We follow the lectionary, and I think you're right about the marvel moving towards the Gospels. It means that we only get selected portion of the Old Testament, and maybe we hear it, but we rarely get sermons on it. Psalms we sing songs, we read songs, I'm working in Psalms right now, and they just kind of drop out too. And then unless we get the lectionary in certain summers, it's reading through one particular Old Testament book.
right.
But then certain stuff just drops out, like you get bits and pieces of 8th century prophets, and how do you talk to something when you only get a snippet of Amos, or,
Right.
and so I think we've become less able to be conversant about the Old Testament because the marvel falls so heavily on the Gospels and the epistles.
That's my point completely. And how this conversation came up with Donovan yesterday was when I heard the gospel reading for Sunday, that fabulous passage where Jesus takes the unclean spirits and sends them the herd of swine, and they go diving off. If any of you want to come to my office after class is over, I've got 2 photographs from my favorite window of my church in Charlotte. I was at Covenant Church, Charlotte, had Willett windows, which were sort of the Tiffany stained glass windows of mid-century, Willett out of Philadelphia. And they're just absolutely gorgeous. And in the chapel, they were the miracle stories and the healing stories. And when I joined the staff, we had a midweek service on Wednesdays, and the pastor was always trying to get us to do preaching. So another pastor came on the same time, and he and I decided we would preach through the windows as a way to get familiar with the congregation. Well, the last window on looking out from the pulpit on the left-hand side, there are 4 of them, the last one is that story. And there is a line of pigs going over a cliff, and the last one is pink. And it looks like the Piggly Wiggly pig doing the swan. And so I said to Donovan, you really blew the front cover of the bullet. I had the best picture for you. And he said, oh, you're always trying to push me to preach the New Testament. This is flying back to me, because I tease him about it all the time. He finally went to the Old Testament. So he got back in it. All right. I love this little, underneath the Gospel of Matthew, about halfway through that, he says, the Sermon on the Mount is followed by a series of healing miracles and by the sending of the 12 disciples, the clash between Jesus and his adversaries, a series of parables, and the story of his repudiation in Nazareth, his hometown, prompting the observation a prophet never lacks honor except in his hometown and his own family, prepare the way for the second half of the gospel. We don't often think of Matthew in sort of two parts. There is a Bible commentator used to teach at a great little Presbyterian school in Spokane, Washington, named Dale Brunner. And when I went to Princeton, we had quite a few students who came out of that little Whitworth college. And to a person, they had this deep personal piety, sort of the vertical dimension of the cross, and had a tremendous commitment to social justice, the horizontal. And I'm like, they were so mature in their faith. And I found out later, they all had studied with Dale Brunner. And he has a 2-volume commentary of Matthew's gospel, and they're titled The Christ Book and the Church Book. And his thesis is the first half tells us who this Jesus is. And the second half is about what's the church supposed to do because of that. Where interesting, Luke has the Gospel of Luke and then the book of Acts, which in the Cotton Patch version, he calls the doings and happenings of the church. All right. So throughout the Gospel of Matthew, there are many references to the Old Testament and quotations from it, leading many scholars to the conclusion that it was intended for Jews who have become Christian and for Jesus who might, and for Jews who might consider doing so. One of the other things about the structure of Matthew is it's in 5 books, right? There are 5 teaching sections in Matthew. Why do you suppose that's important?
Talked about this last week.
The Pentateuch, exactly. So even though Mark is, we believe written before Matthew, Matthew is put at the front because that's the kind of linchpin between the old and the new, right? Gospel of Mark, the shortest and earliest. They say that Mark is a passion narrative with an extended introduction. Really interesting as a literary document. You read it and the first 8 chapters feel like it's a breathneck pace. And immediately he goes to this. And then when he begins to move toward Jerusalem in the 8th chapter, right? Mark has 16 chapters. The first 8 are all these miracle stories, healing stories, and all that. And then you've got 8 chapters moving toward the cross. And then at the end, you have this question, basically. They were afraid. So much so that later folks added 2 longer sections to it, but yeah.
That phrase is used a lot in the Bible. The response of someone, they were afraid.
Right.
In English, do we appreciate what was originally intended by that phrase? They were afraid.
I don't know, do we?
What do you think was what do you think was intended by the person?
Is it means not all of a sudden confronted with uncertainty?
I think it probably has multiple meanings, right? Afraid because of the storm. My boat's gonna be sunk. Afraid because the authorities are gonna come and get me. I think there's different kinds of fear, but Jesus's answer is, Fear not.
Some of the phrases were, the Roman governors did such and such because they were afraid of the Jews.
That's true.
Same word, I don't.
Same word, yeah.
I would-
Yeah, good. All right, Gospel of Luke, largest single section of the gospel recounting the travels of Jesus through Samaria, Judea and Perea. It's peculiar to Luke, for example, the parable of the prodigal son. And then John, very little in common with any of the other gospels. Gospel narrates the adult life of Jesus around the supposition of 3 years, where the other ones, you almost seem like it's 1 year. Which is your favorite gospel? You have a favorite? And why?
My favorite's John.
John?
I think because of the way it's written. It just speaks to me, I mean, it certainly is different from the other 3 synoptics. But the way it's written, it speaks to me.
Great.
What about the statement in Luke, the very first saying, let me tell you what really happened?
Yeah, I mean, the question becomes with Theophilus, is that an actual individual, perhaps a Roman with some authority, or Theophilus, the people of God? But I'm gonna make a detailed account. I'm gonna give you a good argument that this isn't crazy, right? I mean, it's really quite interesting how all of that comes together.
John's so distinctive. It's almost in a category by itself, but.
Yeah, well,
You could love John and also love one of the synoptics.
right. For me, I came to a deeper faith when I was a teenager in reading John's gospel. Or a different way to put that is I fell in love with Jesus by reading John's gospel. And then when I was in college, it was Luke's compassion, his care for the least, the last, and the lost that really touched me. And now, as I've been, kind of trying to be on this journey of faith since, in a more or less serious way, since I was probably a 14, 15-year-old, it's Matthew's gospel and this high demand of, brother, you should know that there's no cheap grace in your life. I've given you everything. And I personally like the high bar of the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, I've been at this long enough to know how radical this is and how I'm not living up to what I need to be living up. So I need Matthew kicking me in the behind every now and again. It doesn't mean I don't love John, or I haven't lost my love for Luke, but personally, I see myself as, somebody who ought to know better. And that sharp rebuke that comes through Matthew. Some of you have heard me tell the story. I loved when we had Daniel Pott as part of the congregation. And I've been fortunate in a number of my churches to have important academics or lay people who were really reading current theology to keep the rest of us honest. And I had one of Matthew's harsh parables and judgment. And I preached it, but I emphasized grace throughout it. And after the service was over, Daniel came up with a twinkle in his eye and a big smile. He said, that was a wonderful Lutheran interpretation of that. In the Reformed tradition, we see judgment as grace. It's a huge thing in Calvin, because when we hear that word of judgment, it gives us the opportunity to reform our lives and put it back in order. So whereas Luther, it was always the bad news drives us to the good news, right? And so his sermons were bad news, good news, basically stuff. And, it's always about grace. And I sounded like saying, Daniel, thank you for noticing that I just couldn't figure out how to deal with the judgment in a way that worked. But that twinkle in his eyes when he said that, yeah. All right, anything else out of that section? The Acts of the Apostles a link between the Gospels and the epistles. He suggests that, the Acts, the apostles served the New Testament like the history books do of the Tanakh. I think that's, yeah, the very last sentence. The book of Acts performs for the New Testament something of the same function that is performed by, in the Tanakh by the historical books. Without it, readers of the epistles would frequently lose their orientation. Again, there's still a theological thread in it. Tom Long, was Tom gone, Will, by the time you got to Princeton? Tom was my homiletics professor and just a wonderful guy. Talking about the book of Acts, he says, it's like reading session reports or a church history. And the illustration would be is, you know, the women of the church put on a picnic, and it was the best picnic ever in the history of Christianity. So many blue ribbon pies were served there. I mean, it's a little bit hyperbolic, you know, but it still happened, right? You know, how we read it. I've always enjoyed that. The Epistle of the Romans, now we're looking at the epistles, the most complete statement of Paul's teaching, a demonstration of the universality of human guilt, and moves to the doctrine of justification, exhibiting the faith of Abraham. Next, the apostle discusses new life that comes in justification together with his own struggles of faith. Consideration of this leads him to ponder the mystery of how, quote, the whole of Israel will be saved, end quote, and the divine election, a discussion that for some reason has left far more influence on various Christian doctrines of predestination than the Christian views of Judaism. What a great aside that is. The second part of the epistle lists some of the concrete personal and social situations in which new life finds expression. That section 9 to 11 is such an interesting portion of Romans that we often overlook. And what I think is so interesting about it is I don't think he comes to a final conclusion. He breaks off and just goes into doxology. Oh, the wisdom of God's mind is too high for me to know. And I mean, it's this brokenheartedness of why haven't the Jews come on board with this Jesus movement? And part of that argument is, well, you know, God's patient. That's why Jesus hasn't returned until these people return. Another argument is, well, they're going to get jealous of Christians being close to God now. You know, it's this tortured argument, and I think we generally just overlook it. 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, vindication of Paul's apostolic ministry, I'm at Galatians now, is likewise a major theme in the epistle to the Galatians, which distinguishes between the Christian gospel and the Jewish law even more sharply than the epistle of the Romans. It's thus a defense of Christian liberty. Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, the most personal of Paul's letters. It's really fun, as some of you who have traveled with me to in the footsteps of Paul, and shameless self-promotion, it looks like we're trying to do a trip in the footsteps of Paul next spring, in early May. So if any of you would like to do that, keep that, that should be out pretty soon, I think.
Can you say a little bit more about why the literary relationship between Colossians and Ephesians is a puzzle to the New Testament scholars?
Yeah, interesting. They're so close, overlapping and saying similar themes. And I think for some, there's this notion of, you know, they're historically attributed to Paul. Literary analysis suggests that Paul maybe didn't write those. That's the argument for more modern scholars. They're actually in a similar region. Colossae is not all that far from Ephesus. But we think Colossians was perhaps a letter that was taken, you know, you think of the the churches of Revelation, right? The 7 churches that are there by one another, and maybe Colossians was meant to be read in some of those smaller churches. I really wrestle with let me put some cards on the table. I wrestle with a overly narrow analysis of writing. I'm, cleaning out my sermon files. And I've had in a 5-drawer file cabinet in my office, every sermon I've preached in written form since the first time I preached was the Sunday after Easter, 1983. Okay. And there are times where I've read somebody new and I've gotten a new idea. My theology has changed over some things over the years. What I've addressed to congregations that are different has changed. And I'm like, this overly narrow, this isn't Paul's theology here. Well, maybe Paul's addressing something else. But to me, they bear a very close similarity in hand of the two. And of course, again, I think you were teaching a week or two ago on somewhere, well, it was upstairs, I think, the post-Easter class, where you talked about the four high Christological hymns that are in the New Testament. John 1, in the beginning was the Word was with God. Ephesians or Philippians 2, have the same mind that was in you that was in Christ Jesus. Colossians 1, he's the image of the invisible God, the firstborn in creation, and then Hebrews 1, in various ways of old God spoke, but now he's spoken through his Son. Those are the 4 high Christological hymns that are in the New Testament. And golly sakes, I would hate that, Colossians was left on the cutting room floor. To me, it is one of the great affirmations of who Jesus is. Ephesians deals a little bit more directly with family issues. But anyway, so, yeah.
So, I haven't read ahead yet, so are we gonna, that chapter of Ken and the critics, are we gonna ever talk about, some of, what some of the missile writers were trying to do to rein things back in as the church began to form? So like First Timothy, a woman can't teach a man.
Right.
There's some real problem texts going on
Right.
as we move later into the epistle that
Right.
we don't see in the gospel.
Right.
Where everyone is welcome, everyone is loved, everyone is encouraged, and
Right.
the role of women, particularly for Jesus, so important. And-
Well, and frankly, the role of women in Paul,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
without Lydia, Paul sunk.
Yeah.
And
had their homes were home church, house churches.
Yeah.
But we've got these texts that are still alive and well.
Right.
And very much like in our sister denomination PCA, which
Right.
is meeting in Chattanooga this week, and where women still are not allowed to teach anybody above the age of elementary school.
Right. Will's gonna tackle that in another class.
Yeah.
Got all-
No, the book from here on out goes into the history of the Bible. And so it doesn't get down into like the context of the text. So it's more historical as far as the formation of scripture.
But I think your point is so well taken. And, when I teach New Testament, we get to Timothy and the Johannine and Peter. I mean, there's some stuff that comes up in there that seems to be not all that consistent with, and yet I'm grateful that we're seeing this church on a make. How are they figuring this out? And again, my point earlier when I was talking about the Corinthians, is this site specific to something happening in this local church? Or has it become universal everywhere for all time? Which is what the PCA is trying to argue around the role of women in the church. Yeah.
I think something we talked about when we were talking about the Old Testament too, that's really important is there's no singular voice of scripture. It's a collection of books and it contradicts itself over and over again. And so what the church has been doing in real time is taking the witness of all of these books, looking at it through the lens of Christ and saying, where do we place the emphasis and where do we correct ourselves? And so, you know, we come from a tradition that would emphasize that the women are the first people to preach resurrection, and not that women shouldn't teach over elementary. And that's because of the emphasis we place when we read these scriptures. But I think we can't neglect that those other voices are in these same books as well. And so that's the work of interpretation. And I think that's why we call it a living document and not some stale static text. And that's why it's important we do what we're doing right now.
Yeah, and you know, I think Bible classes at Westminster Presbyterian are often blessed because I know we'll have at least one attorney in the group. Looking out, we have multiple attorneys. I did a disciple class with Jonathan Cole one time, and 3/4 of the class were attorneys. It was a fabulous class. But how do you interpret, you know, our founding documents? We've got some who say the originalist position. That's what was meant back there, and we have to stick with it. We have others who say, no, our job is a hermeneutical task. What do those original documents guide us for issues that weren't even, you know, in the framers' ken at that time? How do we interpret this document? And as we try to interpret scripture, that's sort of a similar kind of a job that we have to do. Is it only for what was meant then, and that becomes the universal appeal? Or do we try to understand what was the issue in that situation and what was the vision of the writer, and put that in conversation with other parts of scripture to get an idea of what God is saying to us right now in this place? Really important. Thank you, Liv, for raising that issue.
To get back to Ken's question about Colossians and Ephesians, Vanderbilt OSHA had a series of lectures on the life of Paul last winter, spring, and the teacher or retired professor from Center College in Danville talked about, of the 13 Pauline epistles, I think 7 are accepted to be genuine.
Right.
And then that will mean another 6 are more questionable.
Right.
So are Colossians and Ephesians both among the 7
They're among the
undoubtedly authentic letters?
They're among the sects.
They're not among the 6?
They're among the sects. Most scholars would say that it's unclear that they're Pauline at this point.
And this professor also characterized those, the ones generally Pauline letters have more radical positions taken than some of these questionable.
Yeah, I think that
The later letters described to Paul are walking back or trying to make some of his earlier statements more palatable, maybe to a larger group.
that was Liv's
Okay.
insight, especially as we get into the later Pauline stuff. There does appear to be a narrowing where in some of the earlier ones, especially Galatians, and that it's broad. And I would argue, you know, when we read in Acts or in Corinthians about Aquila and Priscilla, Priscilla has always seemed to me to be the sharp knife in that drawer, right? I think Aquila's, you know, hitched his ride to a good thing, but she's the one driving that ship. I love Priscilla. She didn't get near enough light shown on her. All right, the Christian Bible and the Christian Church. Several factors seem to have been responsible for formation of the Second Testament in the church alongside the Old Testament. One factor certainly was the sheer passage of time, as the church needed to discover whatever resource it could bind its past and to guarantee its continuance in the tradition of faith. Also responsible for the establishment of the canon was the circulation of writings that bore the names of apostles, but did not contain apostolic teaching. as the apostolic teaching was being defined by the church in its creed and enforced by its bishops. I think I heard at the beginning, somebody say, when you were in your small groups, you were surprised at how quickly the canon came together of the New Testament by comparison to the Old Testament. That, you know, realistically, by about 200, the sort of central core of the canon was already established, right?
But part of that was that civilization had progressed and culture had progressed.
Exactly,
And as we've experienced in our lives, things speed up.
right. I think that's absolutely true. And then certainly, as Christianity became from the oppressed religion of the dominant culture to the adopted religion of the dominant culture. But the argument here, and that I would echo, is the core canon had already come together before that. I mean, we may debate on whether some of the books should have been there or not, right? Second, third John, Jude, some would argue Hebrews, I would not, James. But, you know, I haven't preached a whole lot from Second Timothy, Second Peter, or First, Second, Third, or Second or Third John, right? That's not the canon we hold anyway. So there's always going to be a canon within the canon, right? And what was central to the New Testament canon was already established by clearly 200 AD. So, which is miraculous, I think, so anyways. Will, what do you want to say to that?
I'm good.
And there's, you know, Francis Pelikan, that wonderful New Testament scholar, started one of her books about, you know, working with problematic texts and saying, no, scratch that, that's not in my canon, no, that's not in my canon, you know. And you sometimes we do that, you know, we have our favorites, and then we have our problem texts, and that means, you know, we wrestle with these things. You know? And she used that as a point about, you can't remove it from First Timothy, it's there, so what do you do with it?
What do you do with it? Exactly. Yeah, I mean, we're not like,
Was it Jefferson?
Jefferson, I was gonna say, you know, it took a razor blade in the passages and, although, you know, the Jesus, you know, in your own academic career, the Jesus, what were they called? The Jesus movement,
Or the Slave Bible was another.
The Jesus Seminar?
the Jesus seminar folks. I mean, they would use the colored marbles to say what was in and what was out. And of course, AJ was very much part of that group. But you know, how do we deal with the whole canon? And how do we understand by some of those challenging texts, the issues that were facing the church as the church was developing, right? So they're there. And then that's completely removed from the so-called texts of terror, which are there as well. Yeah, Sharon?
You know, I think AJ is a great example of how we should look at these texts, because she always goes back and put it in the context of these were written for the people that lived at that time. And that's what we sort of lose sight of sometimes when we are reading it. We forget that these were real people living through whatever miraculous thing that was happening that they didn't understand. They were afraid, and we'd all be afraid.
Right.
If what was before us was coming true.
Yeah.
And so to read these texts, I have to always remember to put myself in the place of those people.
Yeah.
And in that time in their mores and not mine.
So to end the class today, you get this little nugget, which is a text without a context is a pretext. You can take that out of its and wield it any way you want to, right? A text without a context is a pretext. Yeah. So, all right, no class next Thursday because some of you may be running away for the 4th of July weekend early. it was possible that many of you would be here. We could have had class, but we decided to take next weekend off. But if you want to come next Wednesday night, to see, the original Frankenstein, you'd be welcome.
I thought because that was starting the last 2 weeks in July.
The movie is next week. The book is the last 2 weeks on Sunday morning, but the Faith and Film Sect is starting next week. Yeah,
Don, have you figured out what other movies you've shown?
I have,
Advertising yet?
not yet, but they will be. And goodbye, everybody who is on Zoom.
Thank you.